Yes, okay. Good. So I think it's recording now. Yes, what were you going to say?
Hello, my name is Gonda van Steen, and I'm here with Oliver Baldwin to talk about Sophocles Philoctetes. How about we both introduce ourselves? Oliver, do you want to start?
Yes, my name is Dr. Oliver Baldwin, and I am British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Reading. And I work on a project called Queer Tragedy. So tragedy is very much what I do day to day.
And my name is Gonda van Steen, and I'm the Corais Professor of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature at King's College London. Now, tragedy used to be what I did a lot of. Lately, I've shifted my interests elsewhere, but I welcome this opportunity to reflect with Oliver on the richness of Sophocles Philoctetes. Oliver, if we think of the themes that stand out, what would be for you kind of the theme that immediately jumps to mind and that bears relevance on today's world?
I think one of the most important themes, and perhaps actually the running theme in the whole of the tragedy, is how does youth respond to demands that its society puts on them, and also how to face demands that are not quite their own, that they are imposed, that they come from outside, and how to negotiate between your own interest, your own identity, your own priorities, and those that other people decide that you should choose. And I think you see that from the beginning in Odysseus convincing him to trick Philoctetes into giving him the bow.
Him being
Neoptolemus. Sorry, yes, of course, I should have said the name. So yes, you can see this from the beginning when Odysseus tries to convince Neoptolemus to trick Philoctetes into giving him the bow, and he's very reluctant to do this at the beginning because, of course, he has just come into the war. He doesn't really know what all of this is about. He hasn't met Philoctetes yet, and he is the son of Achilles, so it is supposed that he is quite a lot more noble than Odysseus himself, who is always the mythical trickster. And from that moment, Odysseus does manage to convince him, but then as soon as he actually confronts Philoctetes properly and sees the pain of Philoctetes, then he starts to break down, and actually he realizes that he is exploiting this poor man who is suffering. I think that is a very good way of thinking about precisely these demands that sometimes society puts on young people who don't want to do any of this, who have other interests and who see the world in clearer eyes than all of these people who have other strange interests in the war and in the world and in tricking people.
Yeah, I like how you point out that the rise of a consciousness, of a human consciousness, even a humanitarian consciousness, becomes an overwhelming feeling in Neoptolemus, but it comes about in the confrontation with human suffering. And that is both physical suffering, but it doesn't stop with physical suffering. It's both physical and mental suffering. And I actually see as a very potent theme the trauma of Philoctetes. Of course, he has been bitten by a snake and the wound doesn't heal. In fact, it develops some sort of a gangrene-like condition, which delivers the kind of smell that encourages comrades to leave him behind on a godforsaken island called Lemnos, very close to Troy actually, but completely inactivated, completely cast, actually dumped, in other words. And so the trauma that comes with the physical trauma of the wound that never heals is, of course, also the mental trauma of abandonment. And you can see that Philoctetes is in quite a troubled state, actually, and that Neoptolemus, as a young man who has a lot to learn, actually learns from that encounter with both physical and mental trauma.
Yes, and there's also a feeling of complete abandonment in Philoctetes. Not only has he been abandoned by his comrades, but there's also always this figure of Heracles kind of as a huge cloud over his head that makes him remember who he is, and remembering a certain dignity and a certain status that he used to have, and now he has lost because of his, stinking wound. And I think that isolation is something that, in a way, brings together Neoptolemus and Philoctetes in this. They're not quite part of it. They've been brought to this war when they're both kind of outsiders. In one case, because he was never there, in the case of Neoptolemus, and in the case of Philoctetes, because he's been actually pushed out of the war. So that kind of social isolation of them too, I think, is one of the reasons that brings them together. So I completely agree.
Picking up on the word of isolation throughout ancient Greek literature and all the way into modern Greek times, the use of islands as some sort of de facto incarceration locations is of great interest to me. In fact, I've delved into that more deeply when Greece used prison islands, as we call them, for communist dissidents immediately after the 1940s, and actually at the tail end of the 1940s. So the whole idea that you can almost like reify a person's isolation by sticking them on an island where one would otherwise not go. And in fact, Lemnos is said to be uninhabited. And so how you can isolate people, but actually make that isolation so complete in that one is constantly confronted by the small island boundaries. I find that actually very interesting dynamic that runs through time. Think of the setup, for instance, of Guantanamo Bay as the kind of insular isolation inflicted upon people. So it makes exclusion even worse, because it's also cutting the supposedly ideological rot out of a population, a biopolitical move to stick people on an island and then just kind of completely deactivate them and reducing them to what Agamben would call the bare life. And when we reflect on that condition, that there's actually no joy in life, that it's bare to the barest instincts, we think again of Philoctetes and him having to use the bow to do some very basic hunting gathering, and then limping his way out to his prey to be able to just simply survive. So the condition of the person reduced to the bare minimum of survival is actually very clearly at work here. And that also raises some level of consciousness in Neoptolemus, because he's never seen anything like it. His own father was always the hero, had the privilege of withdrawing himself rather than being pushed into separation. So in this kind of discovery of Neoptolemus, of a different kind of paternal figure, I think the island location and the island misery and the bare life of the island play quite an important role.
Yes, and it's interesting that the isolation of the island is also in a way demonstrated by the way that Philoctetes speaks about the island as well. This idea of this rugged isolation that does have a volcano in it, so it also has something that is similar to his wound. So there is in a way a similarity between himself and the island, and also perhaps in very Greek way, isolation in an island is complicated because, of course, as being a thalassocracy and being a seafaring community, there is the odd person who appears, gives him some food, gives him some rags, and then disappears, which actually demonstrates the isolation, because he repeats, nobody takes me with them, nobody gives me safe passage. So he is given charity, not help. And I think that is a very interesting point, precisely in the relationship between Neoptolemus and Philoctetes. Neoptolemus decides to help him, not give him charity, help him. And although at the beginning that help is an excuse to get him to Troy, just at the very end, he actually relents and says, okay, well, if you want me to take you back home, I'll take you back home. And I think that is a very interesting question that is developed in a very subtle way. And another thing that has to do with isolation in Guantanamo and island prisons is the mental health, in a way, of Philoctetes. It's been demonstrated that after a certain point, I can't remember how many days, but after a certain point of you not having any sort of communication with anyone, you start to develop certain mental problems. And curiously enough, when Neoptolemus appears with his sailors, Philoctetes actually says, "Are you Greek?" And as soon as they speak Greek, he says, "That wonderful sound." And although that could be read on one side as a kind of a Philhellenic kind of, love of, Greek culture and Greek language, it might just be that he is aware that he hasn't spoken to anyone for so long. And he suddenly is shocked by the fact that he can communicate when he hasn't been able to communicate for all this time. And you can see it as well in the way he's trying to communicate. He doesn't quite manage it at the beginning. He doesn't quite know what questions to ask, what information he actually wants, what information he doesn't want, because he hasn't had all this interaction all this time. I think that is very subtly and carefully explored by Sophocles in the tragedy. So yes, absolutely, I agree.
I like the reflection on language as both the bringer of joy, capturing joy and excitement at being able to use it again as a communication tool. And then, of course, language also as the ultimate tool of deception, if you put it in Odysseus' hands or in the first phase of Neoptolemus' behavior. Language both as attractive and also very treacherous, very dangerous. The same very Greek language, of course.
Yeah. And perhaps this contrast between Odysseus and Philoctetes, of how Odysseus's communication is one based on trickery and one based on deceit, while Philoctetes, because the majority of his communication has been through cries of pain, he still has a lot of cries of pain throughout the tragedy, and it is a lot more kind of animalistic way of being, a kind of more brought to basis. And actually, when he's going to leave Lemnos, he actually says goodbye to the animals, and he says goodbye to the island. He says goodbye to his companions, to his company, throughout all of that isolation. So I think definitely the double-sidedness of language, of kind of a direct honesty in words like son or friend. He calls Neoptolemus constantly son and friend, and these quick sentences, like kind of, cheap wisdom that Odysseus gives Neoptolemus, I think shows precisely this dichotomy in which Neoptolemus has to deal with, what sort of person am I, what sort of game am I playing, or am I even playing a game at all? So definitely that is definitely there.
I like how we come to the topic of an identity crisis, which is of course prominent in the character of Neoptolemus, but imagine what it does to the identity of Philoctetes when he realizes that the value they put on him is actually the value they put on the bow. It is the bow that is the tool, and in almost rather harsh terms, if we left it to Odysseus, we would, Neoptolemus and Odysseus would just steal the bow and be off with it, because the bow is the key to victory at Troy. But do you take the bow, or do you take the whole person? Is one ready to take the bow and then put the person in seclusion, in exclusion, or can the value of Philoctetes himself be reconceptualized as a worthy fighter who will be a person, a warrior at Troy, one of the heroes again, rehabilitated, not just because he has the bow?
Yes, that's very interesting, because I think it goes together with the dehumanization of Philoctetes. He is first thrown in the island as if he was a kind of smelly rag. He's he's dehumanized to the point that he's not given help. And actually he complains. He says, you know, they leave me here with just some food and a few clothes, you know, they don't even give me any sort of dignity. And when they come back for him and actually don't want him, they want him as the kind of, you know, the shooter. They want him as the tool with which to use the bow. And even the bow, it's not because it's his bow, it's because it's Heracles' bow. So even in those cases, kind of, he is just a necessary pair of hands. And even at one point, he's not a necessary pair of hands. Even when he says no to going to Troy, Odysseus says, well, who cares? We've got, you know, we've got one of our Greek men who is very good at shooting as well. You know, we don't even need him for that. But Neoptolemus doesn't see him that way. I think that is the whole point. And I think the fact that he has the perspective of youth, and he has the perspective of trying to do what is just, not what is necessary, perhaps, not what is essential for certain interests, but how you should really treat someone in that circumstance. I think it's very clear, and I think it shows a certain tension that we live nowadays between older generations not quite believing global warming and you know, young people believing in global warming and actually campaigning against global warming, not so much because it is in their favor, which it isn't. I mean, you know, changing our ways of life in order to save the planet is not kind of in our selfish interest. It is in the interest of everybody. It's the right thing to do, but also with questions around refugees, questions around care, around, you know, LGBTQ rights. The young people of today can see the world from perspectives very similar to Neoptolemus. Neoptolemus, in front of these dehumanization, says, no, this is unacceptable. You know, I have tried to play this game of not caring, and sorry, I do care, and I'm going to do something about it. And I think that is definitely there. Yeah, sorry.
And I like that Neoptolemus understands that you have to want to care for the individual, even if Odysseus could very well make a rather inflated claim of the supposedly greater good being victory at Troy. So for Neoptolemus then to take a step back and what is that greater good if the individual in pain in front of me supposedly has to be thrown under the bus? I can't believe in that kind of greater good that doesn't recognize the dignity of every individual that makes up the real greater good.
Indeed, nobody can be left behind. Exactly, that's the whole point. Neoptolemus kind of says, okay, maybe there's this thing we have to do together, but nobody can be left behind. You know, Philoctetes is someone who should be respected and who should be brought onto the project rather than just being exploited as Odysseus wants to do. Exactly, I completely agree.
You mentioned the kind of peculiar role of Heracles. Do you want to reflect a little bit of Heracles' last showing in the itself? Because I have a certain unease with the Deus Ex Machina.
Yes.
So do you want to share your take with me?
Well, what do I think about Heracles? I mean, I think in the end, in a way, it's a Deus Ex Machina. So in the end, it's kind of like, well, we've got to a point where we have to solve it some way. And I think what Heracles does do in a way is level. One of the things he does is level the debate. He kind of gets around and says, well, this is not about Odysseus trying to bring his, the interests of the Greeks before anything else. And it's not Philoctetes being kind of too stubborn in his pain and not understanding the bigger picture. He's trying to say, look, if you come to Troy, then you will be cured, and therefore this can be solved. And also stop complaining about your pain, because I have been through great pain as well, and it's brought me great achievements. And to Neoptolemus, he's saying, you know, you've got a mission here. You can't be neglectful of your mission. We can find a way to conciliate responsibilities and you know, humanity and caring. We can put them together, but you must get on with it. You know, that is what you're being called for. But what I find extremely interesting is the possibility that actually Heracles is not Heracles. If we play a bit with the 3-actor system of ancient tragedy, in which you have the chorus and then you only have 3 actors playing the different roles, of course, at some moments in stage, it's been Philoctetes and Neoptolemus and Odysseus, but Odysseus is off stage, and on stage only Philoctetes and Neoptolemus remain. So that 3rd actor has to play Heracles as well when he's already played Odysseus. So that there is the possibility, perhaps, that it is actually Odysseus in disguise as Heracles, trying to convince these two to do precisely what he wanted to do from the beginning. And I see that as something, that possibility, that little kind of idea can take us to some very interesting places of thinking about power and how power disguises itself in many ways in order to convince us to do certain things. I find this very similar to how we try to be conscious about the dangers of the economic system we have, and the way we exploit people and the way we treat people. But at the same time, we are drawn into things like social media or things like Instagram, in which that precise system is perpetuated and defended, but it's defended in a nice way. So kind of consumerism, capitalism, which we kind of abhor when they talk to us about capitalism and consumerism. As soon as we go into Instagram and we see someone very good looking, drinking or eating or buying that, then we buy into it. So in a way, Odysseus is doing that with Heracles. Because he's pretending to be a god, then the message can come in easier. And they buy the message. So I think there's something there about power and establishment finding ways of ultimately convincing those who are reluctant.
And it is interesting that the play won first prize, so that means a certain level of approval within Athenian society in 409 BC. And there is also, of course, the lost Philoctetes of Euripides, which I would die to have, and in terms of what that would do and how the plays would start to talk to one another. But I think we've pretty much covered it for our audience, and we leave our audience now with their own questions and ideas about the play that will soon be shown or has already been shown, but that very interesting Philoctetes that has made it into one of the key ingredients of King's Greek this summer. Enjoy it. Thank you.
Yes, enjoy it. Bye-bye.